I recognize that we are in a time, and especially over the last couple of years, the issues and questions pertaining to particularly anti-Black racism has been first and foremost in our kind of consciousness, particularly with the death of George Floyd. Also recognize that for many of us, we have been engaging in work around our relationship with the Indigenous peoples of this land. And although my particular focus today will be around anti-Black racism or racism as it relates to people of African descent in the Canadian context, I want to acknowledge that the principles that we will talk about, or the processes that we'll talk about, doesn't preclude application to other forms of racism in terms of anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, and other folks who get excluded on the basis of race. I also want to say as a way of introduction that my conversation with you this morning is located in the nexus of three kind of ideas. One is the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his articulation of what he calls the beloved community, and recognizing that in King's understanding of the beloved community, in many ways, for King, it was the kingdom lived out in its reality. That the beloved community was a community where all were welcome, valued, and honored, no matter what the color of their skin was. And so that's a concept, an idea that certainly captures my personal imagination. I'm also within the context of a piece of work by Abraham X. Kendi, who talks about how to become an anti-racist. And Kendi talks about the notion that part of the journey of becoming anti-racist is to look at the kind of structural impediments that impact the lives of Black peoples. And the third nexus, or third piece of this nexus for me, is the reality that I'm talking to a group of people who have a cultural heritage that is predominantly kind of European white. And so I recognize that in that, the kind of nexus between the beloved community, the need to attend to systemic barriers, and the fact that my audience are people who have a cultural heritage and history and expression that is predominantly white. And so I want to move in between those spaces and hopefully rooted in my own kind of Christian tradition, be able to offer some insight, and I hope stimulate your imagination. For me, a critical piece of any kind of engagement I have with people is to help to stimulate imagination. And Paul Ricoeur's statement that if you want to change a person's behavior, you must first change their imagination. And that's something that I take quite seriously, and is a space where I am rooted in that. The other thing I would say, just by way of kind of introduction or laying the table, is the recognition that you will find me dancing between the language of Black and the language of African descendant. And that language of trying to find a language of how we become descriptive, it will be important. So that's kind of a bit of kind of location of where I am at and where we're going to be journeying together. And I want, as we begin this time, for you to just to take a moment and respond mentally, and we'll probably come back to it, is that what is your expectation out of our conversation today? What are you hoping will happen for you and for the communities that you represent by participating in a conversation like this? So if you just kind of take a moment and think about that, keep it foremost in your mind, and as we come towards the end of our time, you may want to revisit that to see if something has shifted in that regard. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think that through. All right. So I want to do the first part of my conversation with you this morning is to explore, and I'm going to name three, but I recognize that even in naming that, you may think those are the only, but I'm going to name what I call three preconditions of moving towards becoming anti-racist. And the first precondition that I want to lift up is that we need to appreciate or understand that racism is a theological issue. It's not simply a sociological or a political issue, that at its very heart, it is a theological issue. And that theological issue, I think, relates to how we see the other. Now, I'm going to, this is a quote from a papal bull and from 1452. And I know some folks will kind of think, well, this doesn't have anything to do with us. But in many ways, this is, I think, part of the kind of theological framing of our understanding of how racism happens. And so part of it is that here is the Pope given permission for the exploitation of other human persons by folks from his particular context, right? And in some ways, this is what frames the kind of genocide of indigenous peoples, but it's also what frames the experience that we know now as the transatlantic slave trade. That at the heart, the theological issue is that of racism is how we perceive the other, and how we perceive the other whose skin color is different from ours in terms of their value, in terms of their understanding of who they are as created in the image of God. And and I would say that racism flies in the face of our fundamental understanding and commitment that in the beginning God created, and that when God created human persons, God created them good. And the challenge of racism is that there's a sense in which we have learned that there is a hierarchy of how God created and who God values over others, right? And so it's that kind of notion that is embedded in this papal bull in terms of the whole fact that to reduce these people because they're pagan to perpetual servitude, right? Slavery begins in that. You can begin, and I'm going to use imagery from the experience of people of African descent within the US context. But and just to kind of push this point around understanding that racism is, the theological nature of racism is an issue about the personhood of the other. And so, when you think of images like this, and, certainly we're in the context, again, of where, how can anybody do this kind of behavior to another person if you don't see the other person as being value and worth. So you can do this because these aren't people, these aren't persons, these aren't folks who bear the image of God. And I think until we can begin to kind of see that behind this notion of race and racism is our fundamental understanding of who is human, then we're not going to resolve the problem. And talk about how we begin to do that. Apologies for these images, but they were some of the stark ones that I think could help us kind of get the point. You treat people this way because you don't see their basic humanity, right? And that's the key thing, that the fundamental issue, and I'm repeating myself just for emphasis, the fundamental issue why racism is a theological issue, it's about how we understand and define the humanity of folks who have Black skins or skins who are not white. And it's in our kind of history to see those people as less than, right? And we can talk about our experience of our mission enterprise. We can talk about the language that we have grown up with. They're heathens, right? And they until the white master savior comes, they continue to live in a sense of being heathen. They're uneducated. But you can think about all the language that you've grown up with or familiar with on the missionary side of things. So it's fundamentally about the humanity of the other person. And it's also important to understand that our Christian tradition, our current Christian tradition, for the last 500 plus years, is rooted in a concept of race and racism that saw white Europeans as being the folks who are the closest to the image of God. And it gets expressed, we continue to express that within our communal lives. So if you think of our liturgical life and our liturgical practices in the ways in which we dress, right? In the United Church, ministers wear alb, and majority of the ministers who wear alb, they're white alb, right? And we live with this dynamic in our liturgy between white as representing of purity and dark or Black or whatever as representing of sin. And we reinforce our liturgical practices, reinforce this notion of white as superior to Black, dark, right? And in our liturgical life, especially, we're coming at the end of the season of Epiphany, and we're coming out of the Advent Christmas season, where we play with of light and dark. And in some ways, we need to find new ways of that expression because it reflects this notion of who's pure, who's not pure. And so even our liturgical tradition, it shows up in our hymnody. I was thinking the other day, I don't know if it's in the Lutheran hymnal, but certainly in "Just wash me and I shall be whiter than snow, whiter than snow, yes, whiter than snow. Just wash me and I shall be whiter than snow." What the crap? Sorry, excuse my language, right? And in some ways, we don't even think about it when we sing it, right? We need to kind of look at the language of our hymnody to say, how does the language of our hymnody continue to perpetuate this distinction between whiteness and darkness which is rooted in a sense of that dark is not fully human, right? The other place is that it's rooted in our formation. It's how we are formed, both in our catechesis, in terms of those of us who go to seminary, that there's an implicit bias in the way we are formed. Let me just stop this for a minute. In the sense that, I was just in a workshop recently with Dr. Angela Parker, and she's talking about the fact that the scriptures come to us out of a particular context, right? And one of the contexts she says is that the scriptures come out of a context of people who have been colonized. And so there's something in the scriptures that are about the ways in which these colonized people tell a story to undermine their colonizers. But we're taught in much of our seminaries to read the text as a way that supports the colonial project, as opposed to critique and undermine it. And the reality is that scriptures come out of a particular context. The teaching of scriptures come out of a particular context because we all live in a particular context. And so in some ways, as someone who went through theological education here in the Canadian context, and not once in my theological education did I have a non-white professor teach me anything around theology, biblical studies, and that kind of stuff. And what we don't recognize is that people like me get trained to think like the dominant culture because we're always coming at the text from where we sit. And so we're not often exposed to people whose life experiences differently, and they're coming at the text out of their life and lived experience, so that they bring another perspective to the text. So again, we need to recognize that there's this interweaving of this kind of theological theme of the non-human, right? And in some ways, also the recognition that we forget that the folks who penned scripture, many of them were from contexts where their skin color is not white, and we read it through that lens. So starting point, racism is a theological issue. It's a theological issue that is about how we see the humanity of the other, the person created in the image of God, how we use language that reinforces a sense of good, bad, white good, dark bad, that then just kind of reinforce this notion. So we ought not to be surprised in many ways around the fact that racism is still an issue. It's a prominent issue in the church because we don't see it, because we've been so formed in our theological imagination that we don't understand that. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that a second precondition, I think, to becoming anti-racist is that we need to decolonize our imaginations. I think some of you may have seen this picture before, but it's certainly one that I use often when I do these presentations. And think about where Jesus is in this picture. And I'm going to invite any of you who want to unmute yourself and just interact with me. What does this picture say to you? This is the image that motivates our mission enterprise. The illiterate, uneducated, right? Until we appear either in person or through our resources, these folks don't have fullness of life, right? That's the imagination. And unfortunately, it gets perpetuated through our development agencies, right? I mean, look at this picture again and kind of ask yourself, you know, what does this tell you about these kids, right? We learn nothing about their lives except we have this image of them being desperate, right? We judge their dress by how we would dress our kids, right? So we communicate this notion of poverty, of desperation, of needing help. Don't get me wrong. I think the economic systems that they probably find themselves create some of that, but this becomes a kind of framing image for us, right? And we see these images, and it's very easy for us to dip in our pocket and support because we want to make a difference, right? And these kind of images of people of color continues to shape our imagination, right? I tell the story. Number of years ago, I was the senior minister of one of a significant Baptist congregation in Toronto. And I was asked to be on the board of a theological seminary in the city. And in fact, I went on the board with my eyes wide open. In fact, my friend at the time who was chairing the nominations committee for the board, I was in Vancouver at a meeting, and he tracked me down in Vancouver, and he said this plainly to my face. So I always am willing to take on these things because I have an ulterior motive. They may have ulterior motives, but I also have my ulterior motives. And so he said to me, Michael, we need a person of color on this board. Will you do it? After some thinking, I said yes, partly because I had my agenda as well. So I showed up at the first board meeting to discover there were 24 of us on the board. There were 3 women and myself, and one of the women was Asian. So there was that was the diversity. The rest were all white men. And I had 4 conversations, and after the 4th one, I just went back into my shell and didn't engage. But I had 4 conversations that went the same way, which was, who are you? Well, I'm Michael Blair. Where are you at, Michael? I'm at Walmer Road Baptist Church, which is a congregation I was serving in Toronto. And then the next question was, who's the senior minister? And the assumption was that somebody who looked like me could not be the senior minister of this congregation. So in desperation, I rolled my eyes and I said, I'm the senior minister. None of the 4 people that I had the conversation with was prepared to stop at that point in time in the conversation. They persisted. And the next question they asked was, so what's the makeup of the congregation? And in their minds, somebody who looked like me couldn't be the senior minister of this significant historic congregation in Toronto unless the congregation had somehow shift that they weren't aware of and become a Black congregation. Right? And that's how some of this kind of our imagination about how people who look like me, people who are African descendant, or people who are Black, what our abilities are. There's a suspicion, and it's built into our system. It's built into our system. Our system here in Canada it's built in, right? If you come from certain contexts, you have to prove yourself. Somehow we don't trust the training. So I belong to the United Church, as you know, and for a long time, any person who didn't come from, who was not white, and didn't come from Europe, the US, or who came in through the admissions process, the first thing we did, even though they were ordained ministers in their denominations, first thing we did is that we asked for their transcript. We sent it to one of our theological schools to evaluate the course, and we would require them to go back to do more theological training, right? That's how that gets built into our system in terms of our understanding that we don't see the full humanity of these folks. So it's back to this question about the theological thing. So I think we need to be conscious of the fact that our imaginations are wedded to a notion of the ability of people of color as compared to our system, and that works its way subtly through our system. The other thing I want to suggest is that we need to kind of take a look at the ecclesia art in our system. Just think for a few moments about where you worship. Walk through your building. I suspect most of your buildings will have some kind of picture of Jesus or something, and to think about, so who is in those pictures, right? So look at this picture for a moment, and kind of what does it elicit in you as you see this? I'm going to show you two more pictures, and then I'm going to invite you into a breakout room for about 5 or 6 minutes to kind of talk about what do these pictures elicit in you as you see them, and could you see them as part of the art in the life of your church or community, and could you use them beyond Black History Month on a bulletin cover or someplace? One thing I want you to kind of appreciate or understand is that sometimes our imageries, we get so comfortable with them, we don't kind of see them, or we don't think about what messages they ensue, right? You know, as a Black man, person of African descent, if I walked into a congregation and saw myself represented, it does something. It does something to me. It changes my perception. And so often people like me walk into places where you live and work, and there's nothing that reflects who I am. And the strong messages that come from that is that there's no place for me here, right? You don't see me, right? And so I think it's important for us to kind of think about both the kind of images that get displayed in our spaces, and the fact that what those images convey, right? So you can get to the point where it has no significance; it's just there. But for somebody like me coming in and seeing that is just this notion that everywhere I go, Jesus is white, right? And we can argue, I can have an argument that Jesus was a Palestinian And so the color of his skin is not as white as we make them out to be, but our images conveys a message, and our imaginations are captured or ensnared by that. So it's important for us to kind of think about those kinds of images. The next precondition, I think, is that we need to understand our context and the history of people, Black folks and people of African descent. And I think one of the missing components for us is that in the US, for instance, the reality of Black experience is in your face. You can't escape it, even though many communities of faith in the US tend to, some of them ignore them. In Canada, because it's not in your face, we have no idea about the history of the Black communities within our context. And because we have no sense of that kind of history, when things pop up, like young Black men get shot by the police, it doesn't even dawn on us to kind of say this is something we should respond to. The talking out of my experience here in Toronto, I was so proud of our city here in Toronto when they began to recognize that in terms of the vaccine rolled out, they couldn't simply just do a one size fit all. They had to begin, they recognized that for certain communities within the city, the response to vaccines were going to be experienced differently. And they understood that for a lot of people of African descent, the long history of how our bodies were used for experimentation created a level of anxiety that people didn't want to take the vaccine. And so they had to come up with a strategy to engage in the Black community out of that history. And again, partly because we don't know that history, we get in trouble. So I want to show a couple of pieces of a documentary that was done on the Black church in Canada, because I think one of the challenges, we don't know the history of the Black church in Canada. We don't even know the reality of a Black church in Canada in many ways. And so again, even just to begin to think about becoming anti-racism out of an understanding of our context when we don't understand the history. So I'll just share a few moments from a clip. Sorry, just to give you a bit of a taste of the history. If you want to, it's over an hour long. It's called Seeking Salvation, History of the Black Church in Canada. And again, what it does, I've given you snippets just in terms of some of the history of the Black Church within the Canadian experience. But my point is that many of us have no idea of that history. And it's important for us to be able to begin to understand some of the history of the Black church. And I'm talking about Black church because I'm talking to religious folks, Christian folks, that it's important for us to understand some of that story and that experience. And in many ways, to recognize that what happened. So you hear there, Rosemary Sadler talking about the fact that, Black folks were in charge, right? And what happens is that as the times have shifted and Black folks come into our spaces and our congregations, because of how our imagination have worked in terms of who they are, then they don't find themselves in leadership, right? They don't. So why would I come and be part of something that doesn't communicate anything about my possibility of being in the church. And if I may just kind of use the United Church of Canada, and Deanne is here, and Deanne can talk about her experience. But they're over. I'll tell you this: they're over 90 Black ministers who serve within the United Church of Canada. The United Church of Canada, Union United Church in Montreal, is one of the older Black churches in the country, a congregation that came about because of the efforts of the wives of the porters on the railroad. Of the 90 ministers who are serving within the United Church of Canada at the moment, 95% of them come from outside of Canada, already pre-formed in the sense that they come as at what we call admittance. They've been ordained outside of Canada, and we acknowledge their ordination, and they become part of the United Church of Canada. 5% of our ministers are folks who grew up here. Many of them have immigrant parents, but who have grown up here in Canada. And with the richness of the Black communities across the country, I have to keep asking myself the question: why is it that the United Church of Canada, for the length of its history, has not attracted or cultivated leadership from the Black communities? That if we didn't have these ministers who came here, we would continue to be a white congregation, right? And so some of it is, again, we don't know the history. Our imagination keeps us in bondage. So I think 3 preconditions, just to say, is that we recognize that racism is a theological issue around the humanity and the human dignity of the other. We recognize that our imaginations have been co-opted in what we communicate about Blacks and Blacks in the life of the church, and the fact of our lack of history and knowledge. I want to end because I want you to be able to spend some time in groups. But I want to move us into, so what? How do we move from the preconditions to the reality of becoming anti-racist? And I'm going to work on 2 items, and I'm going to do them quickly because I want you in some conversation and some feedback if you have on that. The first thing I want to say is that because racism is a theological issue, then it requires from us a theological response. And I'm going to suggest that there are 3 parts to this theological response. They're kind of interwoven. The first is repentance. Now, I want to say this because I recognize it. I'm going to try and say this diplomatically and with grace. I recognize that many of you on this come out of a particular cultural heritage, and that for many of you, there is a focus around your kind of heritage and history, and your religious Christian tradition is tied up with your heritage as well. So I recognize that, but I want to say to you, that does not excuse you from the recognition that you are, and I say this, and I say it with grace, I say it out of a sense that I love the church, And I recognize that I've been privileged in the life of the church. But I say this boldly, that those of us who claim any kind of heritage in the Christian faith, we are part of a system that has done violence to people of African descent, not just all over the world. It is part of our history. And I think God calls us to a space of lamenting our apathy, lamenting our ignorance, lamenting our kind of refusal to appreciate or understand the damage that has been done by those of us who claim the name Christian to people of African descent. And I think the starting point of becoming anti-racist, and I know within the context of the religious kind of lives that we live, the language of repentance and lament is, we say a prayer of repentance in our worship, and that's where it ends. That part of the repentance is about a change of mind, change of heart, a moving in a new direction. And we need to lament the pain, the hurt, the violence that has happened to people, Black folks. The transatlantic slave experience continues to be an issue for those of us who look like me. And we need to lament every day that we are part of that system. And unfortunately, we need to lament, but we don't need to stay in a space of lament. But I think things aren't going to change if we simply talk about it or put statements that racism is sin, if we're not prepared to actually go on our knees and confess to God that we are part of a system. And in many ways, we contribute to that system of exploitation and violence against people of color. So I think it's an important spiritual action for us to lament. And that's an important part. We need to be about reconciliation. And reconciliation is not an option for us. We're told in the New Testament that God has given us a ministry of reconciliation, and we have been called to be reconcilers. And so we are part of that call to reconciliation is about building relationships. And in our context, we need to find Black communities that we're going to engage in relationship building as part of that reconciliation. For some of us, it means that we're going to have to challenge the values of people in our context and our families as they speak about people who look like me. For some of us, and I'll come back to this, we will need to end our silence. Silence is complicity. And so the ministry of reconciliation to which God has called us to is a ministry that calls us to end our silence. And again, our silence is not simply about making statements about, but that comes out of our relationship with people. And we need to make reparation. So I want to suggest that part of that reparation, is about making space. We need to be committed to making space. And I'll come back to some of this. So I think that the starting point about becoming an anti-racist communities is that we recognize that because racism is rooted in a theological imagination, that we need spiritual practices to move us from that place. And the practice of repentance, reconciliation, reparation It's a story of Zacchaeus. Jesus comes and says, Zacchaeus, I need to eat at your house. You need to show hospitality to me. And in that experience of being of hospitality being expressed by Zacchaeus to Jesus, Zacchaeus says to Jesus, look, Lord, if I've wronged anyone, I'm going to make restitution fourfold. And so that there's something about our encounter with Jesus that invites us into a place of reparation and reconciliation, building relationship, and seeking to reverse some of the damage that we've done and to contribute. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes just about some practical ways of you doing that. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that we need to identify the systemic barriers to exclusion in what I call the fullness of life. Racism robs people of the fullness of life. You will often hear Black folks talk about how tired they are. You'll often hear Black folks say, during February, everybody has an interest in responding to the reality of Black lives. And once February is over, it's over. So nothing out of the Black History Month kind of moves us forward. So I want to be very practical here, and I'll suggest some things, and then I'll invite you in some group for some conversation around this. So the first thing in terms of removing systemic barriers is to end our silence. Part of that comes with us understanding some of the history and the experience. Some of it requires, and I know it's hard sometimes to be on top of everything, but I think we're called to understand what the people in our communities are experiencing and what are the obstacles that are facing immigrant populations, racialized immigrant populations, dealing with populations, indigenous populations. We need to end our silence. We need to be able to say, it's interesting if I can just, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started its work, settler Canadians thought it wasn't their problem. It was the Indigenous people's problem. And I think the first two kind of public gathering of the Truth and Reconciliation process was predominantly Indigenous peoples who participated, until the penny dropped and settler communities recognized that it's all our issues. And I think the challenges that are facing, the systemic barriers that are facing, so some of you may experience, and I don't know Winnipeg that much. I pop in there twice a year, and I'm always concerned about the cold when I go in December. But folks, this. Some of the people who drive taxis in your city are professors, are doctors, are lawyers from the countries from which they come. Some of them come because of challenges that are happening in their communities of origin. Some of them come because we have communicated to them that Canada is the next thing to heaven and it flows with milk and honey. Some of them come because they're running away from wars. Some of them come because their identities as gays and lesbians or trans put their life at risk every day. Some of them come because they have stood up to their political masters, and their lives and their family lives are at a place where they have to make some choices. When you and I remain silent to push and not push our governments to make different choices about how they deal with these immigrant communities who come, we contribute to the violence that these folks experience. I once worked with a woman who traveled 3 hours a day to work for 3 hours because working was important to her, and the only place she could find employment was required her to travel 3 hours a day to get to a job, to work 3 hours a day. She wanted to look after her family. Our silence perpetuates the injustice that happens in these spaces. And whatever your context is, I think it's important for you to commit yourself. Part of the work of reconciliation is to not be silent. Stop being silent, because your silent perpetuates violence. And if we're going to become anti-racist, that's an important factor, because there's violence that happens to folks. The second thing is invest. You need to invest. And I want to suggest a couple of ways in which you can invest. And when I talk about invest, I'm talking about invest in time and monies. So one of the things, if you want to impact, start to kind of diminish the systemic barriers that lead to that takes away from the fullness of life of people, one of the things you need to do is invest. And one of the ways you can begin to do this is to shop, look, search. These days it's easy to find. What are the Black-owned businesses in my community, or Asian, or whatever the predominant group in your community that experience exclusion? Economic investment is critical. So commit yourself to at least 50% of your spending is going to support Black-owned business or Asian-owned, or in your context, there are a lot of Filipinos in Winnipeg. That's something that's important, because by helping sustain the economic realities for folks, it begins to do that. Look for partnerships with folks in your communities who are working to end the systemic barriers that people face. So there are folks who are working to support folks, kids, in terms of their academics. I think I can't remember the organization. I know it has there's a group in Pathways to Education, for instance, is an example that's working to try and support the academic enhancement of the lives of Indigenous and racialized people in Winnipeg. So look for Pathways to Education, and is there a way you can invest some time, energy, some funds, but work with communities that are attempting to work with their own communities, sustain. And you don't go as somebody who is going to be the white savior, but you go as somebody who wants to, in a mutual kind of way, provide ways to help them. And a third way I think I'm going to just suggest is this. I was just invited to be a part of a project recently, finally, to try and put together a theological biblical reflection from a number of voices on being Black in the Canadian context. Most of our seminaries, most of the places where we are connected with, don't have racialized professors, and that's a problem. Some of it is that some of the students, people who look like me, who want to do advanced education, PhDs or whatever, don't often have the resources. So put together a scholarship fund, make it for a Black Canadian in one of your institutions as a way of supporting and nurturing leadership in the Black community. Well, those are some practical ways in which to begin to lean into becoming anti-racist. So it's not about making statements, it's about being proactive, shopping, investing with groups who are working, and for me, contribution to a scholarship. I'm sure your imagination and minds can take you in a million directions of ways in which you can begin to provide some support. And the final thing I want to say is, and with your bishop in the room, is to look at the ways in which your church structure, your church policies, procedures include or exclude. As Lutherans, I think most of you on here are Lutherans. As Lutherans, you have Lutherans in all parts of the world. So I'm sure in your family of churches, there are Lutherans from Africa, Lutherans from Latin America who come into your context. Is there anything in your system and structure that excludes them from full participation in the life of the church? Do you have a sense that if somebody shows up on your doorstep, we want them to hang around for at least 4 years before we trust them in anything? Now, some of us are desperate enough that as soon as somebody walks through the door, we want to grab them. But how do you make sure that there's nothing in your structure that communicates a sense of you're not welcome? So it means, looking at your liturgical practice, looking at the kind of hymns you use on a Sunday morning, looking at visually, is there anything that communicates welcome if you are not white? And those are some of the ways, like, you need an eye. And that's why I originally talked about our imaginations, right? Because sometimes our imagination is so captured that we can't see. So, and stuff that's familiar with us that we may feel comfortable with may not be familiar, but may not be perceived by the other as welcome, but just further reinforces the fact that I'm not welcome here. So we can do it by languages, and you can get it online, right? Because these days you don't have to necessarily have somebody who speaks the language in your pews, but you can, read a scripture in another language of people in your community, so you can have it on a taped video, project the English or German, whichever language you use, so that the folks in the pew have what's familiar, but they're hearing it in a different thing, right? And even just to cultivate in your communities a sense that we may all look this way, but there's diversity out there, and we're going to create a space of diversity inside. All these are ways, I think, that we begin to move towards becoming anti-racist. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to invite you, as we gather back, I'll pause for questions, kind of comments, feedback folks may have about anything that got raised in your discussion group, and then I'll do a couple of things and then hand it back to Bishop Jason. So. Question, and one of the things I was going to wrap up with was also talk about we need to think about intersectionalities around our experience. So I think if we start from our experience, recognize that when you add the layers, other identity layers onto that, it gets very complex. And so we've got to think about that. So I would say a couple of things to respond to that. That I think in some ways the door in may be around those intersectionalities, in the sense that if there's some intentionality about, so women are getting together to talk about the experience of gender issues, I shouldn't say women, when there are gender discussion, is to invite other voices in, even if you don't have those people necessarily as part of the group. So part of the intentionality is, could we invite other voices to speak to that so that we get a sense of what their concerns are. Sexuality is the same thing, is to make sure we have other voices. It's interesting, if I may use myself as an example, and I don't get it, I don't understand it, that I'm asked to speak, I would say probably 99% of the times that I'm asked to speak around my race, the racial issues. I'm a Black gay man, and I'm not invited to speak around my identity as a gay man and what that means as a Black gay man, right? And so in some ways, we can sometimes forget the fact that people's lives are more complex than we want to make it be. And so part of it is just to be intentional. So, you're having a conversation around sexuality is to make sure that you have the voices of other people's whose identity around their sexuality is just as much as whatever their issue. So to make sure you have a person of color who is gay, recognizing that sometimes that's harder because for some cultures, people don't feel safe around their sexual identity to be part of public conversations. So those things happen around relationship. So I guess it's back to, when we have relationships, we can invite people into spaces to contribute to whatever the enterprise is. But when they're not, I think there's also a piece, and that's why if I hearken back to our imaginative things about how we see, part of that imagination piece is also where stereotypes come from. And I know in some circles within our Christian life, we tend to think that people from the African continent or the Caribbean continent are homophobic, for example. And so we tend to exclude them. And again, just stereotype, we just say, oh, they're homophobic, and not do the work of finding folks in those communities who are not homophobic, because there are a lot of us in that community who are not homophobic, who live our reality. So I think it's just how our stereotypes come to play. But I think it's an intentional commitment that whatever the conversation is, we look for other voices, right? So we often aren't conscious of missing voices, right? And so part of it is even just a discipline to say which voice is missing, and do we have relationship to invite those voices in, because they help us see the world in a different way. Sorry. Often you are never, and I'm using never just for effect, but you are never asked to represent the whole, right? Your voice is respected as one voice in whatever conversation you are in, whether it's around gender, sexual identity, ministry. My voice gets heard as representing the whole, right? So when we, to your point, when we invite other voices in, we expect that those voices represent the whole, other than that voice is one perspective. And because the lived experience of that person can bring new insight into our conversation. And so again, how do we not fall prey to the assumptions that if we invite a person of color, an Indigenous person, that they're going to speak on behalf of their whole? You know, I can parse it. I'm Jamaican. My lived experience is different than somebody who grew up here in Canada, as it is different from somebody who comes from Africa, or somebody who comes out of the UK. Our skin colors may be different, but our experiences are quite different. I came to Canada in the 1970s. My perspective is different from the folks who came in the 50s and the 60s, as it is different from the folks who came in the 80s. So I can't speak out of the Jamaican experience for all Jamaican immigrants. I can speak out of my experience, out of the window of time that I came, because I came to Canada in a particular context of time. And so my thing for us is always to think about communities. There is no, I mean, the mantra for all of us has got to be, there's no such thing as a community. It is always communities. And I think if we start to kind of help ourselves to kind of think that way, then we realize that we invite people out of the communities to share out of their experience, and they're not speaking for all, and we can't go away. And even this conversation, you know, I can think of many of my colleagues who, if they did this presentation with you, would go in a different direction. You know, it comes out of my lived experience, but it also comes out of the fact that I'm the general secretary of a white church. I've been part of this church for a number of years in a role that meant attentiveness to people who are excluded. So that shapes the perspective I bring. My colleague who is in the congregational ministry would bring something different because they're rooted from a perspective of congregational ministry. So I think it's, you're starting to push me where I wanted to close, but I'll pause and come back and ask if there are other questions. I think it's important to inculcate in our communities an appreciation of differences. And not just when somebody like me come into the space, you want to appreciate differences. But I think it's important that even in a congregation where everybody looks alike, to practically talk about our differences, right? Because what happens is that we reinforce the cultural norm that if we look alike, then we believe the same kind of things, right? So one of the things, just an example, one of the things I used to do in the last congregation I pastored was that once a month we provided an opportunity for storytelling, and it was controlled storytelling in a way, in that we had, I was lucky that I had somebody who was a journalist in the congregation. And so I would give her a list of names every 6 months, and she would do work with those folks to be able to tell their stories. So sometimes she would do an interview with them. So depending as she talked with folks, what may be comfortable, she spent some time with them and figured out what was the most helpful thing, whether it was being interviewed or whether she would just introduce them, they would share their stories and she would wrap it up. What was amazing in that experience was that people who had known each other, who had been part of the congregation for 30 years, started discovering things about people that they thought they knew, but didn't know, right? And that's a subtle way of just kind of saying, we look alike, but we are not different. We have different political views. We have different kind of theological understanding. Where we grew up shaped us in a way. We're all shaped by our context. And if we look at it and we say, oh, we have a congregation, everybody looks alike, and we don't intentionally work at lifting up differences, right? Because I think when people get comfortable with differences, because those of us of the generation of who are here, and I'm making an assumption and I'm stereotyping and I'm doing everything that I'm saying we shouldn't do, grew up in a sense where differences was something to be feared, not something to be celebrated, right? And when you cultivate this climate of difference, then when somebody who comes in who doesn't look like the group gets a sense of, oh, this there's a space for me here. And so once you start doing those storytellings, you also have to look at, and I know we come from rigid liturgical tradition, which is going to kill us, sorry. If we don't find freedom in our liturgy, if we really believe that liturgy is the work of the people, then what we do liturgically, I know there's disciplines to liturgy, but what we do liturgically needs to reflect the gathered community. And most of the time it doesn't reflect the gathered community. And so, it's a struggle. And those of you who are bishops here need to kind of wrestle with that, right? So I think if you start telling stories and people begin to recognize the difference is a gift and begin to see that difference reflected in how they be together in the life of the church, then when somebody new comes in, it avoids assumptions. Assumptions are so easy. So I think, Jason, you may have heard this story. Let me tell you this story. It's a United Church story, so you don't have to be embarrassed by it. I'll tell two stories quickly. One of our ministers in a congregation in the Niagara Peninsula, and the Niagara Peninsula is one of those places where there's a lot of farm workers come to work during the farming season. And so on this particular Sunday, this young Black man shows up to church. And after the service, the minister went, and it's so natural. It's so natural to do. And his first words to this individual was, "Which farm are you working on?" Right? We'd all do it. We just assumed, right? because again, it's part of how our lack of appreciation of differences makes us, the easy way out is to stay within the stereotypical understanding, right? So this young man said, I'm not working on a farm. I'm a postdoctoral fellow from so-and-so. I'm here working at the hospital for a year. And I was looking for a place for my family and I to worship. My family will be coming to join me. Right? A guy never came back to church. Right? Because again, when you get into this space that of shortcut with stereotypes does, we do violence. And one of the ways to get us out of that space is learning to tell our stories, and people when they look a lot like us, to be able to tell our stories. And that's one of the tools, I think, to help us get there. A personal story, I was called to a congregation in St. Catherine's. I was a white congregation that I was called in my Baptist life to be the minister of that congregation. And the Sunday in which I was to be installed in the congregation, in the Baptist tradition, as in most of our tradition, we invite congregations from other Baptist congregations in the area to come and join in the celebration. I was out in the gymnasium, the sanctuary. You came through the back and you were immediately in a gymnasium. I was out in the gymnasium just pacing, and somebody came in. There was going to be a meal afterwards, and somebody came in and spilled what he was bringing in. And sometimes your life goes into slow motion. So I was observing, and he looked around the room a couple of times, and he finally made eye contact with me and came over and asked if I could clean it up, which I did. I knew where the mops were, so I went and cleaned it up. Said nothing to him because I knew what he thought. Right? Only Black person in this space must be the caretaker. So in that tradition, as the new minister, you stay in the pews until you are introduced, and then you come forward for the official installation service. So when they introduced me and called me forward, and I got up to the platform, I did what he did to me, and I looked to find him, and I made eye contact with him. And you could tell from his reaction that he almost died, because never in his wildest imagination could he have assumed that white congregation would call a Black minister, right? So our assumptions get in the way, and part of the way to, I think, help us out of that space is to help us to begin to understand that differences is a critical part of our life together, right? I mean, that's the gospel. The gospel calls us from different places, different walks of life, different experience of life, calls us to be together in a space and to live out what we understand and appreciate as God's kingdom, God's beloved community. And God's beloved community is made of the diversities of people with all their dignity, their warts and all, everything that God has created them to be. And that's the power, you see. And I think that's why in the epistles, the epistles are all about, folks, we're called to live together. It's not going to be easy. We're called to live together. This is what the gospel means. We live within the context of our differences and our diversity. And I think as clergy, as people who are faith, we need to be able to model and for people to understand this diversity that God has woven into. And it's not when we get to heaven and we see the people from Africa and the people from Asia, it's even in the midst of all the faces that look like us. God has created differences. That is the gift of our community. And I think we just need to live into that space. We need to honor it. We need to, and that's why I would say, if that is true, and I believe it in my heart that it's true, then the liturgy, the work of the people, needs to be reflective of who the people are that God has brought together for us to be God's people in any space of time. And we become people who are always conscious of the fact that there are those who don't gather with us, that we need to be aware that they are missing, and to ask the question, why are those people not here? And I would say, friends, one of the painful part of my experience in the life of the church is that my white colleagues don't even turn a blank eye to the fact that their voices, communities, peoples that are missing in any space, they just go on as if nothing has happened. And it won't change until you and I begin to say we need to be conscious of, and that we exist for the other, not just for ourselves. Enough preaching. I'll stop. Sorry. I would say two things. One is, there's a certain level I'd say join the club. The disciples who lived with Jesus, it took them a long time to figure it out. So I think that's one thing. I don't think we need to beat up on ourselves. I think we need grace to function. I think if we beat up on ourselves, we nothing will happen in some ways. But the other thing, and I would say this, is, like, do you believe the gospel? How do you read the gospel? Like, so, sorry, I truly believe that God's heart and God's hunger is for those of us who name the name of Jesus, to take seriously the fact that we are part of a movement that is about transformation. It's about the fullness of life. It's about justice. It's about making sure that all of God's creation, people and the earth, experience life's fullness. If we take that seriously, then, friends, I think we can't simply check out. We can't. I can't. We can't. So I think the question I would say back to you, Laurel, is, do you take the gospel seriously? And if you do, then let the Spirit guide you to live into that in a way that doesn't beat yourself up, but it's about taking the gospel seriously. So I don't want this to be about me, but every day I've been part of this church in formal leadership in the life of this church since 2008. And every day it's about trying to live into this space that doesn't always see me, or if they see me, they don't realize what has created the me. And I have to try and function in a white world, day in, day out. And that can be draining. It can take life away. But I'm convinced, when I met Jesus 40 odd years ago, Jesus made a difference in my life. And it's that difference that sustains me today. It's that difference that calls me to invite people to think differently about how we be this beloved community that God has called us to be. And that all of us have to stretch sometimes in the places we are. And in some ways, again, I want to be just very clear that it's not all about people that look like me, but in the communities, I want to say in the communities where we are, because we have to work from where we are outward, that we recognize that allowing our folks, helping our folks to celebrate the differences that God has created in us creates an environment that others come in and see. Here's a people who value who I am, not just value the color of my skin. My response is that if you don't see my color, you negate the reality of who I am, because this visage has influenced and shaped my life. And when you don't see my color, then you completely negate. And so I think it's important for us to say that, when you say you don't see color, you're doing a grave injustice to people of color, because you actually negate them. Because there's, because of the color of my skin and because of the context in which, so I'm a Jamaican. I've lived in Canada longer than I've lived in Jamaica, but I still identify myself as a Jamaican. There's something in having been rooted there in the color of my skin and the relationship and the church and the spirituality that formed me in that place. I'm, the prejudice and the racism I've experienced and my ability to navigate life out of that is something that shapes me, right? It's similar when people, I remember when I first came out, and after about a year, I met somebody and started to date. And one of the elders of one of the congregations who I pastored basically said, I love you and I want to be part of your life. And I said, fine, you're welcome to. And as soon as when I started talking about this person I had met and our relationship, she said she couldn't handle it. And I said, well, then you don't love me, because that's part of my life. If you can't choose which part of my life you love. And so I would just say, and this is where, as I said earlier, part of the silencing we need to stop is just to say, do you realize when you do that, you just simply negated the reality of who that person is when you don't see color.
I do want to thank you, Michael, so much for being here today, for presenting to us, for teaching us, for helping us to engage in not only our own racism, but systemic racism as well. It is a giant mess left to unravel, and clearly not able to be done quickly or easily, but you've, I think, helped us to start pulling at those threads. So I do want to thank you so much for that. especially for naming so clearly some of these preconditions, things we need to do in order to start becoming anti-racist. Things like seeing it as a theological issue, looking at it as decolonizing our imaginations to see what's possible, and also understanding the history and context of Black people and what that means within our church. And then, of course, giving us the real practical kinds of things to move that into reality. I so appreciated your talk about all of this, and I think my takeaway, especially for myself, is that this isn't like I think we have done typically in our church, see racialized communities as a project or as a problem to solve, but rather creating a space of diversity. How do we welcome people as they are, who they are, into our spaces as they are, and in a way that offers full inclusion? I think that's so important. Shameless plug for all of you in the MNO Synod. When we're talking about getting to know each other and discussing differences and all of those kinds of things, small group ministry would be an excellent place to do some of those things, a smaller group. So we are working on that as a project, and if you hear more about it, that might be a way to address some of those. End of sales pitch. But I will also say, Michael, again, we appreciate it. And for the rest of you here who know, Michael has foregone his honorarium for speaking here today. And so instead, we will be making a donation to the 2S LGBTQ Fund through the United Church of Canada, which supports activists and those who are working to combat issues of inclusion for sexual minorities around the world. And so we will be contributing to that, which is a fund that Michael is quite involved in. So again, thank you. I hope that we can learn from this, take this beyond just February, and see this as a theological issue of something to live out our faith each and every day. And that this is the start of something that will inspire us to be a church that does take seriously the gospel and that takes seriously our baptismal vocation as well.